Welcome back. My name is John Shent with Vista Sense Solutions, and I realized something over the last couple of videos that we've recorded and released is that we haven't really gone through a lot of the terms, the glossary, definitions of different things that I talk about. It's partially from me being in this world as long as I have, where I don't necessarily see those terms as being foreign, but we're trying to help other people learn. So I wanted to take you through a brief introduction of what an API gateway is, what this API gateway is, and some of the terms that we'll be talking throughout this video, previous videos, and future videos. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments. We will get to them as quickly as we can, and then we all learn a little bit something from that as well. So let's get started. So what we've got here on our left panel is a high-level overview of where an API gateway can sit. I'll say this is probably the most common use case, and then how the interactions work between API gateways and backend services. I wanted to make sure that we had the policy manager open as well, in case we need to go through what some of these other words and terms that I use, just in case. So here we can kind of see left to right, this is the standard flow for an API gateway. So you're going to have users or systems, so we can call these PEs or person entities, and NPEs, non-person entities. That's a term that you'll hear me use quite often, especially since we work in certificates. And so certificates or PKIs are going to typically feature either a human, a PE, or a machine, a server, an NPE. So these are two common examples of what we typically refer to as your source or your requests. So requests will be coming through from one of these two entities or types. They're going to process through the API gateway, and the API gateway can limit traffic, it can expose traffic. There's a lot of different things and permutations of policy, and we're going to talk about what policy is as well. But really for right now, until we get into the policy manager, API gateway is going to be your enforcement. It is going to receive all of the requests. It is going to send all of the requests out to the backend services, or it's just going to stop the traffic where it is. So API gateway now has our request from our services. Assuming everything has processed, everything is checking out, all of the rules and controls have been assessed, and this request can proceed. The API gateway will send that request through. Now, you see here we've got three different backend services. We can call them data stores, we can call them web services. It can be essentially whatever you want, anything that can handle the traffic being sent by the API gateway. And we've got here, you can see we've got a /test1, /test2, and /test3. So theoretically, one of these services has said, I want the API gateway's test1 endpoint. So the API gateway takes that request as a HTTP argument or URL and does its control, does its checks, and then sends that information to test1. In this case, it's going to go to this server. If it was test2, go to here, test3 down below. From there, it's very much a request response transmission. So something requests to the API gateway requests to the backend service, the backend service returns a response, the API gateway returns a response. So kind of back and forth throughout the process. And this is essentially what happens in a REST-based call, is you'll have a request, this computer or this server will wait for a response from this gateway. This gateway will make a request out to one of these backend servers who issues a response, and then that response comes back. So this is a centralized view of the gateway, and this is probably the most common use case. So you'll notice that the API gateway is located in our DMZ, and this is again more common for the typical use cases of an API gateway. It exists in the DMZ because we don't want these services to have direct connection to these endpoints. Maybe these endpoints, maybe these backend services don't have security, maybe they're relying on the API gateway, and maybe they don't want to implement the controls that the API gateway already has provided. So if you think about having to replicate things 3, 4, 600 times, where something can do this once and get it right the first time, it's where you have an API gateway. So, like I mentioned, this is kind of that introduction on how the API gateway works within a network and where the typical use case is for that. So we're going to move over into our policy manager because I've made note of a couple different things, a couple different terms that I've used over the last several videos, and I want to make sure that we understand what we're talking about. It's really hard to learn if you don't have that common lingo to communicate with. So that's what we're going to do. When I refer to a service or an endpoint or any sort of policy endpoint, what I'm talking about is specifically what the gateway calls an API service. And so you'll see here we have several different endpoints here. So we've got the endpoint or the service name, which is compression test or display audit or carpenter route, and then we have the actual endpoint itself. And so we'll bring this up and we'll see a little bit of information here. This is our resolution path. And so this is what the gateway is going to be looking for from these services. So when they're sending requests through, if they're hitting the gateway URL / compression test, then this policy can start. The gateway knows that we're going to access this bit of information. We're going to use these rules to process this request. And this specific API gateway uses a regular expression capability, so it will find the best match. So if there is a compression test and there is a compression test 2 and a compression test 3, what would happen is if a request comes in for compression test 3, we have an exact match. If a request comes in for compression test 33 and we don't have a specific match, but there's a wildcard here, this will match compression test 33. It will match compression test 3472 as well. So the wildcards can be very popular and very powerful when you're having to route lots of different things that all start with similar paths. They can also be dangerous because they route things with similar paths. So you really have to understand what your APIs are doing and the structure that your overall services are trying to work with. So we'll also bring up our catch-all because this is the best example of a true wildcard. So in the event that, for our compression test example, if there is nothing that routes to any of these policies, what will end up happening is our catch-all, which is just a wildcard, will come into effect. And the API gateway will say, this is the policy that we are going to route. This is the policy we are going to evaluate. And so if we didn't have this in here, if there was ever a policy that did not exist or an endpoint that did not exist, and a service is trying to hit the gateway or access the gateway or put a request through the gateway for that endpoint, the gateway will return an error. And so we use our catch-all as a best practice to give information about the request, but without giving a heads up or a determination on the underlying infrastructure. So you can see here, and we'll talk about some of the assertions later, But we have a response. It's going to return a 200, even if the website couldn't figure out where it was supposed to be running to. And it just says, welcome to our API gateway. If you are attempting to access a different endpoint, please make sure your service is working as expected. Normally, we would return a 404. So 404 in HTTP response codes is a page not found, or a file not found, or something not found. So you'll see that if you try going to a website that doesn't exist anymore, or if you try navigating to a link that is broken, typically you'll receive a 404. So a little bit of insight into HTTP response codes. If you're going to be working with API gateways, HTTP response codes are a great tool to have. So we typically have a background or some sort of reference page that's up very quickly, so we can reference all of these. As you'll see, mostly 400s and 500s or 200, but there are times where you'll get 300 messages, and we can talk about all those a little later. So try not to get too far in the weeds here. So we've gone over endpoints. We've gone over the flow of a gateway. Another thing, and we just brought up in this video as well, is an assertion. So the definition of an assertion actually comes back from computer science and math before that. So an assertion is a statement that returns either true or false. And so you can think about it as a large complex equation that boils down to either a true or false, a binary 1 or 0. And that's really where computer science brings it in, and we get it from math beforehand. So if I bring up this pen, this is a blue pen. I guess it all depends on what everyone's monitor setting's at. But this is a blue pen. If I said, is this pen red? That's false. I said, if this pen is blue, that's true. It doesn't matter about the ink. It doesn't matter about the structure. It doesn't matter if it's a click or if it's a twist. Is this pen blue? True or false? And so what we have here is a list of assertions that all evaluate to true or false. And this gets into our next video, which is speaking in policy, or understanding or thinking in policy. Because what we want to do is, when a request comes in to the API gateway, we need to make a very quick, very easy determination on if this request should go through, true, or if this request should fail, false. And so through that, we have a series of statements which are read top to bottom and evaluate to true or false. And we'll get into all of the folder structures and all that, but I wanted to make sure that everyone understood what an assertion is, and more specifically, how that gets used within an API gateway. So we've gone over API gateway flow, we've gone over endpoints, we've gone over assertions. Those were the few things that we understood that we probably needed to expand upon, that we needed to have a little bit more information on, a little bit better context when we're going through the rest of our videos. So feel free to bookmark this, feel free to reference this. The goal was to have this relatively quick, but also understand what the capabilities of this gateway are as we get into more and more advanced terms and more advanced permutations of policy. So again, I'm John Shent with Vista Solutions. Thanks for the time. Talk to you later.